In this movie, we're going to have a look at creating compositions. So if you want to follow along, open Creating Compositions AEP. Now, when you're working in After Effects, you work within projects and compositions. Some people find that confusing, so I find that it helps to think about projects and compositions in terms of cooking a meal. Now, that might seem a bit weird, but if you think about the project panel as the larder where you store all of the ingredients for the meal, and then think of the composition as the bowl or the pot that you use to mix the ingredients together. And then you put them in the oven and come out with a finished, lovely, delicious meal at the end of it. Now, you can have as many compositions open within a project as you want within the limitations of your system. Now, you need to create compositions, and there are a few ways to do that, so we'll have a look at them here. So the first thing we're going to do is go to the Composition menu and choose New Composition. Keyboard shortcut is Command-N or Control-N on PC. So I'll choose a new composition, and that opens my Composition Settings dialog box where I could give it a name. So I'll call it My First Comp. And down here we can choose presets, and these are the most commonly used resolutions used in After Effects for output. So we have all of our standard definition, NTSC and PAL settings here. We have HD settings in this section here for high definition. And then for film, we have very high definition settings, up to 4K. Now, you can create custom resolutions if you want to, and you would do that by just clicking on Custom and filling in the settings yourself. But you'll notice that we have settings for width and height and pixel aspect ratio and frame rate. And if you're unsure what to set here, you're best to choose one of the presets. So we're going to go down here and we're going to choose one of the presets. So I'm going to choose HD, and we're going to choose HD TV 1080 25 as our preset. And that sets the width and the height, pixel aspect ratio and frame rate for me. Now, if I was to switch to another preset, so say DV PAL widescreen, you'll notice it changes all of these settings for me. So let's just go back there again. Let's go back to HD TV 1080 25. And we're then going to click OK. And that creates a composition for me. And that consists of two things, the composition panel and the timeline. Now, at the moment, there's nothing in there. So if I drag the time marker, I don't actually see anything happen. In order to populate this, I need to drag footage into it. Now, I can just manually drag footage into the composition like this, or I can drag it down to the timeline. And either way, it will appear here in the main window. Now, you'll notice that the footage doesn't fit my composition. So there is another way of creating compositions, which is really good for situations like this, where you want the footage to fit the comp. And that's just to drag the footage down onto the New Composition button. Now, clicking the New Composition button on its own would normally bring up the Composition Settings dialog. But if I drag a piece of footage onto it and then release it, it creates a completely new composition, and you'll see that the bounds of the composition are fitted nicely around the video layer. And we can see that it's named the composition after the video layer. Now, if we switch between these two open compositions, there's my first comp, where you can clearly see that the edge of the video layer doesn't meet the edge of the composition, and then this one does. Now, if I need to change my composition settings, I can go up to Composition, Composition Settings, and I can make changes to this. But you can see if we have a look at the composition settings, it's chosen the correct width, height, square pixel aspect ratio, and 30 frames a second, which matches the settings for my footage that you can see up here displayed in the project panel. So very, very handy that. So let's click OK to leave that dialog box. Now, it's a good idea once you have a couple of compositions to start managing your project panel. So I'm going to create some folders here. I'm going to click on the New Folder button and create a folder called Footage. And then I can just drag all of my footage items into that folder. And that just helps me keep things tidy. Okay, so we'll put all the footage items in there. Now, you'll notice you can have a look at those footage items, try dragging in different types of footage. For example, we could drag in this red footage here. And you'll see if I put that on fit up to 100%, that allows me to see the full extent of that piece of footage. Now you'll notice that this image or this piece of footage looks really squashed. You'll notice it doesn't look correct. The people in it look really squashed. And sometimes After Effects reads footage incorrectly. And in these situations, you may need to adjust the composition settings. And in order to do that, you can go to Composition, Composition Settings, or hit Command-K or Control-K on Windows. And with that chosen, you can actually change things like the pixel aspect ratio. Now I know that this is anamorphic, it should be 2:1 aspect ratio. But when I select that, something really odd happens. It seems to squash the footage even more. Now there's two things we need to do here. First of all, at the moment we're viewing things on a square pixel monitor, so we can't really view anamorphic pixels because they just look squished. But if we click on this Toggle Pixel Aspect Ratio Correction button, you'll see it stretches it out and mimics having 2:1 pixels. So it shows us a preview which will look more like the correct pixel aspect ratio for the footage. Now the footage is also interpreted wrongly, and that's why it caused the problem of creating the composition at the wrong size. So in order to fix that, we need to right-click on the footage and go to Interpret Footage Main, and click on that, and then the Interpret Footage dialog box will open up where we can choose the correct pixel aspect ratio, in this case anamorphic 2:1. And I click OK, and you'll notice that now the footage plays correctly. So there are times where you may need to adjust the settings, but it's not a problem if you need to do that. Now finally, you can play around with some of these settings to have a look at the different types of footage, like we've got some PAL footage, some NTSC footage in there as well somewhere. So have a play with the different types of footage, dragging them into new compositions. You can also drag images into new compositions. If I drag this folder of images here onto the new composition icon, I can choose whether I want to make a single composition containing all of those images, or I could make multiple compositions with each of them. I'm going to say single composition. I'm going to ask it to use the dimensions from the first one in the selection, but you can override that if you need to. You can even sequence the layers. So I'm going to choose to sequence the layers. We'll put an overlap in there and make it 1 second cross dissolve of the front layer, and then click OK. And you'll see that now I have a sequence of images playing back in the timeline. If I RAM preview that up here, we can see those images fading on one after the other. Okay, so a few ideas about how you can create compositions and how to store them in this window. Just be aware as well, if you create a composition from an item within a folder, it will place the composition within that folder. Similarly here, if we scroll down, we should see the composition item there. So that's a little bit about creating compositions within a project.